spanning the globe to bring you the constant variety of sport, the thrill of victory, and the agony of defeat. The human drama of athletic competition.
Hello once again, this is Dr. Mark Cole, recording the final screencast for Unit 1, which is on arousal and anxiety. We'll be finishing up our first week material here, and then we'll be moving on to next week. And we actually have, I believe, for next week a shorter set, so you won't have to listen to me yammer, and hopefully you're caught up. We can move forward with this last session, which is entitled Arousal, Stress, and Anxiety, which is actually fairly fitting given that our this may be a new format for everyone. Certainly it's a new format for me, so I have to admit a little bit of arousal and certainly a little bit of anxiety. Make sure we do this right and get you guys the best experience we possibly can. You'll notice at the beginning here we also have our standard study guide slide, so please pay attention to that. And again, since this is anxiety and arousal, we we'll be having a online quiz at the end of week 2, or that's due, must be completed by you guys by the end of week 2. So I typically make some smart alecky reference to arousal and anxiety and test taking and those things, and that will be up there. If you have questions about that, I'll be sending an email out here early next week as a reminder with the to-dos for week 2. Moving on, though, again, this last topic is on arousal and anxiety. Are they the same or are they different? And they are most definitely different. And the easiest way to think of them or to differentiate them is to understand that arousal has no valence. It's not necessarily positive or negative. It just is. It is this heightened physical and psychological activation or sense, whereas anxiety is generally thought of as negative, having that valence of being negative. So arousal can vary from high to low. It can be above your optimal level. It can be below your optimal level, but it's not necessarily valenced. But we do have an optimal level, and we'll talk more about that here in a moment. Again, anxiety are these negative feelings of angst or worry. Oftentimes they're associated with over-arousal or a arousal level that's higher than you would anticipate or prefer. The other thing that comes with understanding arousal and anxiety is the appreciation of states and traits. And we've talked a little bit about this previously, that traits are these pervasive, deep-seated characteristics that make us up, that they can change over time, but it takes something, if you remember the pyramid model of personality, it takes something fairly large, fairly powerful, or what we would say is salient, to reach down and change our traits. And we do have trait anxiety, and we compare this with state anxiety, which is our moment-to-moment anxiety that changes moment to moment and is specific to the individual situations that we arrive into. Now, from a trait standpoint, we do have trait anxiety. I am, by nature, if you've met me in person, and maybe you can sense it from the recordings, a fairly trait anxious person. Day in and day out, I am at a fairly high arousal level. I'm kind of jittery and jumpy and those kinds of things. That's just who Mark is. But moment to moment, my arousal and my anxiety states change. I can still have low arousal moments. I can have high arousal moments. I can have very high anxious moments, such as, when I'm going to give a test or I'm meeting a new group or doing a presentation. I have very low anxious moments when I'm, maybe sitting around watching TV or those kinds of things. So the key thing to remember is that we don't have arousal necessarily as a trait. We do have a preference. We'll talk more about that. We do have states of arousal, and those vary moment to moment, and we can hopefully modify those, and that's part of the intent of the class this semester. And then we also have anxiety, and that's both trait and state. I'm, like I said, a high trait anxious person. And then anxiety appears really in two forms, what we think of as cognitive or cognitively in our head, and then somatically or in our body. So cognitive anxiety is that YouTube video that goes over and over and over and over about all the bad things that would happen, and what if I'm late for the test, and what if I wake up late, and all those. That's a cognitive anxious experience versus a somatic anxiety. The symptoms of somatic or body anxiety are heart rate, respiration rate, increases in blood pressure, as well as those previous two, sweating, maybe inability to focus or attention, although that's a little bit cognitive as well. But you can see where they're cognitive and the somatic differences in anxiety. The key thing that I want you to remember, as we talked previously about, is states and traits. Traits tend to be fairly persistent over time, whereas states tend to change moment to moment. We do have high and low trait anxious people. We'll talk more about that. I'll use myself and my high trait anxiety as we move along. The other important thing that we need to talk about in this section is what is stress, and simply stress is a mathematical formula, if you will. It's that imbalance between perceived demands and resources in the context that matters. So you can have an imbalance between demands and resources and not give a hoot. You won't have stress because bottom line is you don't care, even though you may not be equipped for that situation. But when it matters, whether it's grades or talking to a police officer, or exercising or competing in sports and those things, there's meaning to you in that context. And we think of stress as an imbalance. In other words, typically higher demands and lower resources. That negative equation there equates to stress. Now, that said, having high demands or even moderate demands and too high resources, in other words, what we would think of as a low stress situation or a happy stress situation, can also produce stress. We'll talk more about that with our stress assessment. So the key to think about with stress, it's an imbalance between your resources and your coping skills. And so hopefully light bulb goes off, oh, well, if we can improve coping resources, then our ability to handle stress down the road can matter. Or we can reframe it as not caring and not mattering. You can see we have our little stress process there, and the key that I'd like you to focus on, besides understanding this is a process, is the idea that there are behavioral consequences. So when we perceive stress, when we have that cognitive reality that, oh, my resources don't match, then I behave in certain ways. And so sometimes what we can do is we can change those cognitions, or we can change our physical arousal level to help modify those behavioral consequences. And that's really the point of this next 2 units or so. This slide here, the bridge, I hate to admit it, but I hate it. Hate to admit that I hate it, but I will admit to having a fair amount, even as a trait anxious person, of anxiety just looking at this slide, because the bridge is from the Catalano Provincial Park outside Vancouver, British Columbia. And what you don't see on this is that the bridge is over about a 600-foot gorge straight down. You also don't see that that bridge is made out of wooden planks and cables. And there's simply just netting on the side. And the last piece you don't understand is that the little group of people there in the center of the bridge were jumping up and down and wobbling back and forth. And as a rope bridge, essentially, that bridge moves and sways. And so for someone like myself who's afraid of heights and is trait anxious, to go across that with those knuckleheads in the center, bouncing up and down on that, was very, very challenging. I tell you this personal story because it helps illustrate a trait anxious person who enters the situational source of stress. I really wanted to go across. I thought it would be cool. It's beautiful. This literally is from my phone, so this is what it looks like. It was important because I didn't want to die. Plus, I didn't want my wife to laugh at me. She was with me. But there was a lot of uncertainty. I didn't know what was across. Because I'm a trait anxious person, I didn't necessarily know that I was going to survive going across this bridge, although you can regularly see, people go back and forth. It seems relatively safe. And also, in this image, it brings about personal sources of stress. So I bring my high trait anxiety to the table, my fear of heights, and my knowledge that I'm maybe not the most coordinated and graceful person. So then there's self-esteem in there, and then social physique anxiety. I'm kind of a big person, and so I'm really wondering as I walk down there, what happens if I get to another big person and there's not room for two of us to go across there. So this brings and demonstrates on this bridge a situational as well as personal illustration of stress. Now, the good news about the bridge is that it goes up not onto the land. You don't appreciate this until you walk across the bridge, but the bridge actually goes up into the trees, and you come off the bridge into a series of almost looks like a small village built very high up in these massive evergreen trees. And it was certainly worth the walk over and back, even though my palms were dripping sweat and I was shaking the whole time because it was beautiful up in the trees on the other side. But I did survive. That's the good news. And if you're ever out in British Columbia, I encourage you to try and hit that provincial park, because the bridge, if you've ever seen the movie Lord of the Rings where they're running across the bridge, this is that bridge, and it is literally, they made it out to be scary, and it wasn't that hard. It's pretty scary. But moving forward, this idea of stressors, we can have, and I mentioned previously, we can have positive as well as negative stressors. Part of your activities for this week are to do a version of this Holmes and Ray stress assessment and to write up about that in your journal assessment. So please take some time, maybe pause the audio here or the screencast here and go do that. But what you'll see from Holmes and Ray with their, and I've just put these up on the slide as well as on the sheet that you're going to do for one of your assignments, is you'll notice on those sheets and the points that are assigned to them, there are positive and negative events. I mean, there's marriage on there, there's vacation, there's summer, there's Christmas, there's a number of other things, beginning school, ending school. I mean, all of those can be positive experiences. And so really what you want to do is calculate your total score, I believe within the last 12 months is the assignment. And what Holmes and Ray found was that if you scored above 150, and this is going back in the late 60s, so this is almost 50 years ago. If you scored above 150, you had an increased risk of illness and injury. Some of you may know that I was working here at Western a few years back when I was finishing up my doctorate. In the semester I finished my doctorate, I think it was at like 405 or 406 that semester. And when I did this portion for class, and of course my back, I had tons and tons of back pain because I was sitting around working on my dissertation. But, it did correlate to having an injury with some of those numbers. So very high score above 300. Sometimes we've had students, as you're doing yours, don't feel bad if you score in the 4, 5, 6, 7s. But the important thing from Holmes and Ray that I'd like you to take is that both positive and negative life events cause stress. Marriage can be stressful, but you think of it as this wonderful event you're looking up to. But it's a positive event, and certainly if you talk to friends who've gotten married, and heard these jokes about bridezillas, then the idea of marriage or some other big positive thing like that being stressful hopefully comes through. As we talk more about arousal and anxiety in particular, it's difficult for us to understand exactly how anxiety and over-arousal beyond what we would like to have affects us. And so we've put forward 5 theories that do the best job we can at explaining arousal. And what you'll find by the time we go through these 5 theories is we probably don't know as much about arousal and anxiety as we'd like to know. We have some pretty good indications and ideas, much like the youth of our field that we talked about earlier in Unit 1, but we don't know everything that we would like to know. So moving forward, a fairly simple theory approach or theoretical approach to arousal is what we call the drive theory, and it's a little bit less about race cars and Danica Patrick there than it is about a simple relationship, and that's what the X is for, between arousal and performance. And drive theory simply says that your performance goes up as your arousal level goes up, or your performance goes down as your arousal level goes up. So hence the X format. If you think of mapping that with performance on the left and arousal along the x-axis along the bottom. As arousal goes up, performance can either go up or down, hence you get the X. This is really an overly simplistic view of arousal because we don't always want to be highly aroused, and we don't always associate good performance or bad performance with being over aroused. So drive theory tells us that simply arousal varies by performance, but we're not sure, and it's probably more complicated than that, and it certainly is. The next one moving forward is one that's got a lot of popularity, and it has, I think, probably a lot of traction, but not as much as we'd like. And that's the inverted U hypothesis, this idea that there is a region where we perform at our best, and it's in the middle of our arousal level. We don't want to be too aroused, very far on the right, or very far on the left, or under aroused, sort of the Goldilocks phenomena. Oh, it's not too big, it's not too small, it's just right. And again, the inverted U is nice. It's a little more appropriate, but it's also simplistic, because what we found is that if you take that graph, you can actually squeeze it together, and that there's a very narrow range in which we peak in our arousal performance, and you can also stretch it out. There can also be a wide range, and that varies by skill. We can also crunch it down, so squish the top and the bottom together, showing that we won't get very high performance with arousal changes, and we can also stretch the top and the bottom. So the inverted U is, again, a nice step in the right direction, but it's overly simplistic. Take the inverted U a step further. This work was done by a man by the name of Yuri Hanin, Hanin, who did some wonderful work that started with just anxiety, not necessarily arousal, and then he came back and he revised it. And I mention that because it's important, because we haven't done as much work with all these other emotions as we have with anxiety. But Dr. Hanin said that we all have individualized zones of optimal function, IZOF, and this is for the most part the prevailing theory about anxiety and arousal, that based upon who we are, what task we're doing, how well we know that task, and some other situational factors, our optimal level or preferred level of arousal for best performance varies. So it's, the phrase you'll hear from me all semester, well, it depends. Well, unfortunately, it seems like it does depend, and it depends by person, which means we all have to learn where our optimal level of arousals are, and we know general rules. So, for example, novel or new or complex tasks typically prefer lower levels of arousal, whereas with very well understood and ingrained skills or tasks, or very mundane tasks, we can tolerate a lot higher levels of arousal. So the IZOF is certainly a good model, but it's not completely comprehensive, and the next model, catastrophe model, helps shed some light on this, because what we found, and maybe some of you can recognize in your own sport and exercise experiences, is that sometimes when you get over aroused, your performance plummets. There's not just a drop off, it just you crash and burn. And you see these in sporting experiences. If you've ever watched the movie Tin Cup, or if you did that for your movie observation, or if you're looking for a movie, I encourage you to look at Tin Cup, because you can see this catastrophe theory happen. As opposed to being just an average or moderate drop off, you see a plummeting in performance. So it's this point of no return. So if you add catastrophe and the IZOF models together, what you see is that for some people with certain skills, they need to learn that don't go beyond this edge, because it's a drop-off cliff. And you can only learn that from trial and error, unfortunately. But once you learn it, then hey, I have to be careful with this kind of a situation, because my performance can drop off significantly. And then our last model is what we call the reversal theory. And here's where you see hints of phenomenology again. And that phenomenological approach of someone's interpretation matters a lot. And really, this, colored with the two previous theories, tells us the most about arousal and anxiety. And that is your interpretation of your arousal level, not necessarily whether you actually are anxious or not, or whether how you perceive it is very valuable and important. So you can perceive excessive anxiety as pleasant or positive, as helpful, or you can perceive it as negative, detrimental, or debilitating. Best example here is from an Olympic shooter that I was working with, and she said to me, I think it's really important that I should be a little anxious and nervous going into a competition, because if I'm not, it means I don't give a crap. And if I don't give a crap, why am I spending all this time and money and effort working on this activity? So I should be excited to show off my stuff, and essentially that's what my nervousness is my excitement to show how hard I've been working and all the efforts and improvements that I've made. And so what she's done there, she's reinterpreted, she's shown the reversal in that, okay, yeah, maybe I'm a little anxious, but it's not anxious because I'm going to do bad. It's anxious because I want to show my stuff and puff my chest out with pride. And so this is an important strategy for us to keep in mind when we work with exercisers and athletes, is that, yes, it's okay to be nervous. Certainly, the way she put it, I love using that phrase, because, if you're not nervous and you don't care about this, and if you don't care, then why are you doing it? But then the other piece is to reinterpret things, and that comes from knowing and understanding your arousal level, knowing your anxiety levels and your preferences. And so you can see, hopefully, that reversal theory pairs with catastrophe theory and gets tied into IZOF, and that probably gives us the best understanding of what we have with arousal and anxiety. This is not a perfect theory by any means, but it's also too early to tell for the most part. The thing I want you to remember, hopefully you've already gotten that from what we've talked about, is that our best understanding of arousal, and specifically anxiety as a performance challenging emotion or experience state, is that we have somatic and we have cognitive experiences. So if we have somatic anxiety, we have really sweaty palms, we perspire a lot, we get have trouble focusing our eyes, we get a rapid heart rate, we get a high blood pressure, we get a high respiration rate, then we need to deal with those physical symptoms as they are. If, on the other hand, we're having cognitive symptoms of anxiety, that YouTube video of our worst mistakes, or every shot we've missed, or every error we've made, or if you're asking somebody out, then the YouTube videos every time you've been rejected at the bars or something like that. The challenge with that is that then we have to have a cognitive approach to deal with it. So the multidimensional anxiety theory gives us some information that invalidates the idea that we do have somatic and cognitive pieces to our anxiety. It's not the only way to approach it. We'll talk a little bit more about arousal regulation in our third unit, and we'll kind of come back to this specifically, but I do want you to keep in mind cognitive and somatic pieces. Other things to keep in mind: anxiety typically is a negative experience, as we talked about. It can have high intensity, it can have low intensity. It doesn't always have to be super bad, as we mentioned from an interpretation standpoint. But what's important with our anxiety in particular is how we perceive our control. Can you control your anxiety? Do you believe that you can control your anxiety? Even if you can't control it, do you believe your strategies help you control it? Which is a very subtle nuance, but just that belief that you can control it can sometimes help you surmount and get past those things. Ideally, if you feel like you have control of your anxiety, or you have strategies, then anxiety can be used to facilitate. Go back to my shooter. If you don't, and it's debilitating, then think catastrophe model. You become over-aroused and you lose control. So you can see this flowchart of facilitative and debilitative anxiety there, and then we have differences. We have strategies that come in to affect how we deal with our stressors. These are essentially hopefully coping skills that help us understand whether or not we have control of these anxious symptoms. Do we have the ability to cope? Do we have a toolbox, essentially a psychological skill toolbox? The military is doing some really interesting stuff with what they call comprehensive soldier fitness. Not only are they revising how they do push-ups and sit-ups and running and all those physical fitness testing, but they're also revising how they do their cognitive fitness, or what we call resiliency in the military, because for one of the reasons is when you go to battle, as we're finding now, we have a lot of post-traumatic stress in our soldiers, and we're not preparing them cognitively for the stressors of battle. So much like we train the muscles of the body, we train the brain, we can train the brain as a muscle as well, and the Army's invested billions of dollars in this very thing, and this speaks to that in a more complex realm. The big takeaway for arousal and anxiety, in particular, we use the word arousal to talk about all of our different emotions per se, and just the fact that they can be high or low, and they can be negative or positive depending on how you deal with them, is to understand arousal as multifaceted. This nerdy little slide I have up there has all these multi-sided Dungeons and Dragons dies. You know, it's not just a 6-sided die, it's a 27 or a 36 or a 58-sided die. That arousal has a lot of different sides to it, and each one of us is really different and handles every situation a little differently. And so when you're working with individuals, this uniqueness by person is a very important thing to keep in mind. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is that since we all have our own individualized optimal arousal level, we have to learn what that is. And that's actually in our third unit where we'll learn how to assess our optimal arousal level, and then reset that level to something, if it's inappropriate, to something that is more appropriate. And ideally, we see a linkage between optimal arousal and peak performance. And in fact, there's something called flow that tends to be associated with optimal arousal level. So I use this gun safety and the psyching up to handle arousal. You have to understand arousal, just like a firearm, it's always loaded. It can be your best friend, it can be your worst enemy, it can be a tool, it can, pardon the pun, backfire and really hurt you, so you have to be careful. Arousal, you have to only point it at something you want to shoot. Okay, so you only should focus your arousals on goals that you want to achieve. If you overly focus your arousal, then that translates into anxiety and leads to exhaustion. You have to sparingly put those chips out there, or only focus on something you want to shoot as far as your arousal. You should only pull the trigger when you're inside of your target. So you should only contribute, allow, or delegate arousal towards something that matters to you, a goal, and we'll talk about goal setting in our third unit. So it's important that you have identified goals and that you don't actually pull the trigger and allow yourself to be aroused by something until you get pointed at and are moving towards those goals. And then the other thing is to really understand what your goal is, what your target is. Know your target and beyond, because the first couple times you're going to take a shot, you're going to miss your target. Okay, so what happens if I'm, off my target a little bit? Well, if you're firing a rifle or a shotgun, make sure it's not lined up against the side of your house, because you're going to put some holes in your house. It's not very safe. Very similar to that is the catastrophe theory. So if you over-arouse, then you can have this catastrophic failure. So that's about not knowing where your goals are and allowing yourself to reach beyond them, and then having an unintentional consequence from that. So the importance is, and we'll talk more again, like I said, about this in the third unit, is that psychological skills training, PST, or mental skills training, MST, same thing, we'll use this gun analogy again, is that when you focus your arousal, make sure you're focusing on something that matters, that you know what's around that goal that matters and that it's important, and you don't really pull the trigger on your arousal. Don't get fired up about something unless it really matters to you. And then make sure that when you get aroused by something, that you're aroused for the right reasons, about the right thing, to the right amount. And that comes with learning. So that's an important part that's a little challenging. As we go into this challenging piece, I've got some signs and symptoms over arousal and anxiety on there. I'm not going to read all these. This is a good time to kind of pause the screencast and just read through these and make sure you know these. The other thing to think about is I've got this great picture of Apollo Anton Ono yawning, and they did a great expose on him, I think at the Torino Olympics or this is Vancouver, why he would yawn before his races, because short track speed skating is super, super dangerous. Athletes get severely injured, broken legs, they lacerate legs and arteries and abdomens and eviscerate each other every year. It is a very, very dangerous sport. There's probably about 1 or 2 short trackers killed every year in practices and warm-ups, just because of the speed and the crashes that happen. And so the announcer asked him, how can you yawn before your race? I mean, you can't be bored. He said, I'm certainly not bored. I'm anxious, I'm focused. And what this is a classic example of him bleeding off excess arousal right before his race. So you will typically see him, now that he's retired, it's tough to see him do this, but I did catch this one photo. You see him yawn as a way to bleed off some arousal right before he goes to the starting line of his race. And so yawning is a classic example of athletes who've learned in different ways to burn off some of that excess. The other things we need to think about, as we've talked about arousal in particular, is that it has cognitive and has somatic manifestations. It also has cognitive and somatic influences. So if I'm constantly having that negative YouTube video in my head, that negative YouTube video will start spinning faster and faster and faster. We've probably all experienced that at one time or another. If I'm actually having, excessive heart rate, excessive muscle tension, blood pressure, those things, those will lead to different muscle tension and manifestations of overarousal and anxiety in our body. So we typically see this during finals week. The Butte Health Center on campus gets hammered with back pain, neck pain, headache, migraines, all these things right around finals week, because these are physical manifestations of anxiety and overarousal as we approach studying. You think about this typical studying posture, leaning over a book or something like that, not to mention worrying about your grades. So we see somatic manifestations of arousal and anxiety as much as we do cognitive ones. So there's other things that we see that's kind of a bleed over between cognitive and somatic, and one of them in particular is a visual attention, and that's a little bit cognitive because it's what you're paying attention to, but it's also physical in the sense that your eyes actually focus at different depths and variances. And what you can see from the slides is this idea of three football players. The top one is essentially Brett Favre. If you're familiar with Brett Favre, you'll understand why that's Brett Favre. The middle one is the new rookie the bottom one is Brett Favre. The middle one is the new rookie freshman quarterback, and the top one is essentially Joe Montana, or a very experienced skilled veteran quarterback. And the reason I pick on Brett Favre, even though I am a little bit of a Packer fan, sorry Bears fans, but he was notorious for throwing interceptions right into really, really thick coverage. And that's a classic example of the football player on this image in the bottom, who it looks like they're staring through a small little paper towel tube or right down a straw or something like that. And when you do that, you see your opponent and you don't see all around them. You're so focused only on that defensive back, you do not see the surrounding 9 defensive backs. And so classically, when Brett Favre was playing, you see his arousal level, or they get in a pinch, and he'd try to make the ball go someplace where he just physically couldn't put the ball. It's a classic sign of overarousal. The window for him to get the ball into that receiver's hands is so small. He would notoriously, he may have a ton of touchdowns, but I think he also has the most interceptions. So that's a classic example of overarousal and not dealing with it. The middle one is this rookie quarterback who's trying to take everything in, and so their focus is not just sideline to sideline. They're focusing on, the pretty girl with the hot cocoa 3 rows up in the stands on either side. And so what they're going to do is they're going to pay attention to everything, which also means they're going to pay attention to nothing. And so they're focusing on the wrong cues, and they don't feel the defensive pressure of someone coming from behind them, and they get destroyed by a defensive back who breaks loose. So that's the challenge of our middle one. Ideally, and I just picked on Joe Montana, it could be Peyton Manning, whoever Tom Brady, your favorite quarterback is. The top one is this person's focusing on the appropriate cues, and they're switching from important cue to important cue to important cue very rapidly and making quick decisions. That's what skill gives us. That's what time and practice and veteran status gives us. And so when you think of a batter at the plate, she's paying attention to what's going on with the pitcher and how the outfielders are playing her, how the infielders are playing her, and in the situation, she's quickly shifting amongst all these things, and she can process that. The rookie who's standing at the plate is lucky if she's paying attention to the pitcher, let alone the ball. And so these are important differences. Now, hopefully by now I haven't offended anybody, but If you haven't noticed, the picture of the boys on the right-hand side is not as nice and innocent as it seems. And I always joke that there's one in every crowd. But if you don't see it right away, spend some time and then leave it and come back to it and see if you see it later on. And if you don't see it, then go ahead and send me an email and we'll help you see it. This is sort of an exercise in attention, arousal, and narrating. So we're going to kind of finish up here with this idea of the interactional model of anxiety, interactionism. We talked about it at the very first screencast, that thread that's going to be woven across the entire course of the semester. We have person, we have situational factors. They get molded together, and then we end up with our state anxiety, state arousal, personal anxiety. I'm going to bring high trait anxiety to that situation. You may not. Whereas someone's going to go into a situation not really stressed about it, someone else will be really stressed about it. So we have that interactionism, and we have to keep those in mind when we think about how we're handling people, whether it's a situation or the person that they bring to the table. It's important that we recognize individual differences, and people have many differences, many different influences that affect their arousal and anxiety. And so as you're talking to someone and trying to figure out how to help them find their optimal arousal level, you have to take all of these into consideration. The keys with our anxiety and arousal are building confidence and perceiving control, helping them know that they have control over those symptoms. And part of that is just having skill sets, having a toolbox, we'll talk about in Unit 3, to go into every situation with new different tools to fix them when you're over or under aroused. So that's really it. That's all for week 1. And I apologize that these got up late. I was off on conferences, but I'll end it here, and we'll get Unit 2's, or not Unit 2, but week 2 stuff up here real quick. Thanks.
That's all, folks.